All right, fifth graders, we have finally arrived at the last lesson in our Unit 2 packet. Yay! Right now you need your unit packet. Open up to page 15 and it should say Lesson 11 up at the top, and you need a pencil. Just a reminder, you should be writing down everything I write down. And if you miss something, you actually can, pause me, rewind me, and press play, which is kind of a nice little feature. Okay, so today we're going to be applying what we did yesterday when we reviewed how to round to the nearest 10, 100, and 1,000 to rounding to the nearest whole number, 10th, and 100th. We want to be able to round to our decimal place values as well. So we are going to start with rounding to the nearest whole number, and when we say whole number, usually we can look at the ones place. That's where we're looking. Okay, so we're going to use the same strategies that we used yesterday. If I want to round 4.7 to the nearest whole number, I'm going to look at the ones place, and if I'm rounding to the nearest whole number, it's either going to be this 4 right here or the next whole number up from 4. So if I add 1 to the 4, that would be 5. Okay, so far, same strategy. We're using the number that's in that place, and then we're in the ones place, so we would be adding 1 to it. Now I'm going to look at my halfway mark. Halfway between 4 and 5, we already said the decimal equivalence of a half is 0.5. So 4.5 would be halfway through, okay, or halfway there. Now 4.7, here's 4.5, 4.6, 4.7. 4.7 is going to be more than halfway, right? That means that 4.7 is closer to 5 than it is to 4 because it would fall over here. So 4.7 rounded to the nearest whole number is 5. Okay, let's try the next one. I have 36 and 24 hundredths. I only need to focus on the whole number. So the ones place, there's a 6. So that means my whole number is either going to be, I keep this 6 with it, keep the 3 with it. It's either 36 or the next one up from 36 is 37. So if I'm rounding to the nearest ones place, it's either going to stay what it is or I add 1 to it. Halfway between 36 and 37, again, it's that 0.5, 36.5. Okay, now we have to figure out if 36 and 24 hundredths comes before the 36.5 or after it, because we know it's not exactly it. And this is where when we used comparing place value, this is where it's helpful, because sometimes it's hard to see, well, if this is 5 and this is 24, wouldn't 24 be more than 5? But remember, this is 24 hundredths and this is 5 tenths. So what we can do is, to make this easier, there are 2 digits to the right of the decimal point. For my halfway point, I can go ahead and add that 0 so that I'm comparing hundredths with hundredths. Then it makes it easier to see, 24 hundredths would come before 50 hundredths. That means that 36.24 is going to fall in this section, which means it's closer to 36 than 37. So 36.24 would round to 36. All right, for my next one, this 2 is in the ones place. So my answer is either going to be 252. It's going to either stay exactly the same, or since I'm looking at the ones place, it could be 1 up from that. So 253. Halfway between 252 and 253 would be 252.5. There's not a whole number between those two, right? So that 0.5, 5 tenths, 5 out of 10 is a half. We have talked about that a bit. It never hurts to review it. So now I have to figure out if 252.482 comes before that or after it, because I know it's not equal to it. This doesn't have a 5 in the tens place. And again, this has 3 digits to the right of the decimal point. It's a lot easier to compare them if this also has 3 digits, so you can put your zeros in there. Remember, we're not changing the value. 500 out of 1,000 is still a half, just like 5 tenths is a half. Now we can see, it's 482. If I was counting, 482 would come before 500. That means that 252 is what it's closest to. So when you're rounding to the nearest whole number, you're looking at the ones place. It's either what you see in front of the decimal point or 1 up from it. And just remember that 0.5 at 5 tenths is our halfway mark. Okay, the next set I ask you to round to the nearest tenth. So that means we're going to do the same process, but this time we're looking at the number that's in the tenths place. This 7 is in the tenths place, right? So if I'm rounding to the nearest tenth, I can kind of forget all the things that are after that. This is either going to be 4.7, or what's 1/10 added to 4 7/10? That would be 4 8/10, so 4.8. Okay, now we have 4.7, we have 4.8. We're supposed to figure out a halfway point here, right? So let's see here. What's halfway between 4.7 and 4.8? I know it's kind of tricky, but it's 4.75. And if you're like, well, wait a minute, like where did that 5 come from? Wouldn't it just be 4.5? Well, 4.5 would come before 4.7, but I want you to think about this. Isn't 4.7 the same as 4.70? And 4.8 is the same as 4.80. Now it's a little bit easier to see. Isn't 75 halfway between 70 and 80? So yes, 4.75 is halfway between 4.7 and 4.8. We don't need those zeros. I just put them there so that you could understand why I put that little 5 after the 7. 75 is halfway between 70 and 80, which 4.7 is the same as 4.70. Okay, now we can see, okay, this is 4.72. 4.72 would come before 4.75, which would make 4.72 closer to 4.7. I'm not going to include that 0 because if I ask you to round to the nearest tenth, your answer should stop at the tenths place there. Okay, next one, rounded to the nearest tenth. I know I give you way more digits than you need. I want to make sure you know how to answer all the question types. So this 2 is in the tenths place. That means if I'm rounding to the nearest tenth, it's either going to stay as 19.2, so that number in the tenths place would stay, or I would add 1/10 to it, so 19.3. So this is asking you, when I ask you to round to the nearest tenths, is 19 and 264 thousandths closer to 9.2 or closer to 9.3? Well, we need to list our halfway mark, right? And remember, this would be the same as 20 hundredths and 30 hundredths. Halfway between 20 and 30 would be 25. So 19.25 would be the halfway mark between those two. Okay, so I see that there are 3 places to the right of the decimal point there, and here I only have 2. So it's a little tricky because it looks like you're comparing 25 with 264. So let's go ahead and put that 0 in so that I can be comparing thousandths to thousandths. And now we can see, okay, if I have 264 thousandths, that's going to be more than 250 thousandths, which makes it closer to 19.3. So 19.3 is what we should have for that. And again, my answer stops at the tenths place because I asked you to round to the nearest tenth. Okay, last one of these. This 9 is in the tenths place. So I'm going to start off and write my 0.9. If I added a tenth to 0.9, where would I end up? Yeah, if you said 1, you're right. And think about this. If you had 90 cents and you added 10 cents to it, wouldn't you now have $1? So if you add a tenth to 0.9, you would get 1. And when I'm rounding to the nearest tenths, I'm going to include a digit in that tenths place. If you just wrote 1 here for now, that's okay. But I do want my answer to include the tenths place when I'm rounding. Okay, so again, if I had like 90 cents and I had $1, wouldn't the halfway point be 95 cents? And if that's not making sense to you, remember, I could put those zeros there. Halfway between 90 and 100 is 95. Okay, so 0.93, that's going to definitely come before 95, right? 93 hundredths would come before 95 hundredths. So that would make this 0.93 fall in this section, which is closer to the 0.9. I'm only going to write 0.9 because I asked you to round to the nearest tenths place. I only put those zeros so that we can identify our halfway point a little bit easier. All right, our last section for today, round to the nearest hundredth. And again, good news, we're going to use this same exact process. Okay, now if any of you parents are watching thinking, well, I just remember looking at the digit next to where I wanted to round, and if it was 5 or higher, I bumped it, and if it was 4 or less, I kept it the same. We are going to get to those rules, I promise. But right now, I want everyone to have a visual model and a true understanding of what they're doing, so it's not just a memorizing. Because believe it or not, rounding, a lot of people kind of forget when you haven't seen it for a while. So having this visual connection is really good. Okay, so hundredth. What digit's in the hundredths place? This 2 is. So it's either going to stay 4.72. I can forget about the digits after that because I want to round it to the nearest hundredths place, so I'll stop there. And if I added 1/100th to 4.72, that means I'm adding 1 to the hundredths place. I would have 4.73. So when I ask you to round to the nearest hundredth, I'm asking you, is this closer to 4.72 or is it closer to 4.73? Again, that halfway point is going to help us figure this out. But we have to figure out what halfway between 72 and 73 is. And again, think about it this way. I could look at this as 720 and 730, right? So halfway between 720 and 730 would be 725. So halfway would be 4.725. Okay, so now I have to ask myself, where would this fall? Is it going to fall before 4.725 or is it going to fall exactly or more? And 4.728, that would be this way. That would make it closer to our 4.73. I'm not going to include that 0 because if I ask you to round to the nearest hundredths place, I want you to stop at the hundredths place. So 4.73 is what that's closest to. All right, our next one, the 6 is in the hundredths place. So my answer is going to either be 19.26 or the next hundredths up would be 19.27. The halfway mark, I'm guessing you're seeing we just keep on adding a 5 after our last digit here, right? Well, if you think about this as 260 and 270, yes, 19.265 is halfway between those. If it helps you to put the zeros, then go ahead and put the zeros. So 19.264, I know it's close, but it's still a little bit less than the halfway mark, right? That means that this would be closer to 19.26. I'm gonna stop rating there because I asked you to round to the nearest hundredths. That means I want your answer to stop at the hundredths. Last one, woohoo! This 7 is in the hundredths place. So my answer is either gonna be closer to 77 hundredths, or if I add 1/100th to this, that would mean 78 hundredths. So adding 1/100th means you're adding 1 to the hundredths place. The halfway mark, you guessed it, 775 thousandths. And again, if you're having a hard time with why we're just putting a 5 on here, we're not just putting a 5 on here, it's a halfway mark because technically I can look at 77 hundredths as 770 thousandths. Same way I can look at that as 780 thousandths. And halfway between 770 and 780 would be 775. Now, 772 is going to fall before 775, which makes it closer to our starting point. So 0.77, 0 and 77 hundredths is what you should have. You should stop at the hundredths place because that is what we're rounding to. And now you know how to round decimals. So get your whiteboard materials and get ready to do some practice with that. Thanks for watching.